Welcome to the World Football Summit podcast, the show for football industry leaders who want to stay ahead of the game. We bring you the latest insights, trends, and stories from the experts driving innovation and progress in sports business worldwide. Join us as we dive deep into the ideas and initiatives transforming the world of football. From sustainability and innovation to player development, fan engagement, and everything in between. Our goal is to unite the global football industry and drive positive change and progress. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the World Football Summit podcast. I'm your host, Jaime, Director of Content and Communications at World Football Summit. Today, a friend of the show, Jordan Gardner, is back for another fun review of the global football industry, and specifically about areas that are not mainstream yet. These include Asia or Mexico. We also talk again about club valuations, the state of the Premier League. You can already tell this one was fun. Before we kick off though, quick reminder, don't forget to subscribe and rate the podcast on your platform of choice. Share it with your colleagues and friends in the industry. And if you want to stay ahead of the curve, subscribe to our newsletter. You'll find the link in the show notes. Remember, World Football Summit Asia is taking place on December 2nd and 3rd in Riyadh. You can check the details on our website. And now, nothing else from my side. Let's welcome back Jordan Gardner. Well, Jordan, another round, another interesting conversation on the World Football Summit podcast. There's much to talk about, and it's been a while. But anyway, welcome back.
Yeah, thanks for having me as always.
So what you been up to since we last spoke?
Yeah, lots of travel. Been doing some work on the consulting side. Obviously, I work with a lot of American groups who are looking at kind of the global football landscape. So certainly investors who are looking at a lot of clubs in Western Europe, existing investors, obviously clubs throughout Europe, including the Premier League. And then I think we'll talk about today some folks that are looking at a little bit different markets, whether it's South America or Asia. So always kind of in the football club acquisition space is where I sit. And obviously very close to a lot of American capital that's interested in investing in the space.
Nice. And actually, we're gonna take advantage of your knowledge here. And actually, today we're gonna have a little bit of an unconventional episode, because we're gonna talk about stuff that is not necessarily mainstream just yet. But again, before we go into this, just a small caveat for the audience: this is not investment advice. So and this is two friends just talking about what we're seeing in the industry. So keep that in mind, please. And Jordan, if maybe we can just start with the Asian opportunity, because there's interesting developments in Japan, especially, and it's opening up to foreign markets. Red Bull is acquiring teams. This is interesting stuff. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think Japan's been a really interesting football market for a while, certainly with players coming out. You had Celtic sign a handful of players. Brian has a top Japanese player. The Japanese national team's done quite well. But it's obviously been a very kind of closed and insular market when it comes to ownership or investment or management of clubs. But that actually just changed recently in the last 6 to 12 months. And Red Bull has come in and bought a club in the third division, J3. City Football Group has owned a minority stake in a club, Yokohama, for quite some time now. But in terms of a majority stake, this was the first kind of foreign investment. And, as far as I'm aware, the league has been open to foreign investors coming in, but certainly the right ones with the right motivations. But to me, it's one of these markets that's so interesting. Most of the clubs are self-sufficient, self-sustainable. They have heavy corporate backing, whether it's from Toyota or Nissan or these various kind of multinational corporations. So I think it's a market that a lot of more sophisticated investors that I talk to are starting to get excited about. Obviously, there's kind of some inherent challenges, whether it's culture, language, certainly being first movers in a market like that where there is little to no foreign investment, certainly in sport, can be challenging. But I think it's a market that's really interesting. And, when we talk about a lot of investment, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit later into, the Premier League or Western Europe, there's always going to be interest there, but it's quite oversaturated. I think in some ways everyone's looking at the same clubs and the same deals. So there is a subset of more sophisticated investors. I think now they're starting to look at other markets, and Japan happens to be one of those.
And other than just, these clubs being self-sustainable, and you also mentioned they're being backed by top brands and companies there, is there anything else that makes it attractive, or is that pretty much it, the main reasons?
Obviously, as I mentioned, from a player development perspective and monetization perspective, I think clubs, there's a lot of potential to bring in kind of best practices when it comes from global football into that market to develop talent, whether that's through the academy system and move those players on to larger leagues. I think infrastructure is quite attractive. The infrastructure of most football clubs in Japan is very, very good. So I think from a commercial perspective, there is a lot of opportunities there. So I think those two pieces, and then I think coming in, I don't want to say at a time when clubs are quote unquote undervalued, but when there's not a lot of competition in the market, I think there's long term potential to come in and maybe be a first round investor in a new market and potentially exit to you know investors that maybe want to come in 5 to 10 years when the market's a little bit more stable. So I think there's opportunities on a couple different fronts in a market like Japan.
Mm. And do you think this is going to translate into other markets? Because for a while now, I've been listening, to other regions, and I guess I want to call it Asia, but just that part of the world. For example, India, or is this going to be an isolated effect in Japan?
I think each market is unique. I think India, for example, there's lots of infrastructure challenges in a market like that. And I don't think most of the clubs in the Indian league are anywhere close to self-sustainable. So that becomes difficult to justify foreign investors to come in when these clubs are losing a lot of money. I think a market that has been interesting to a lot of folks that I talked to has been Australia, the A League. Um, they got they had some changes in their structure. The APL, which is a group of owners, took over the league from the federation a couple years ago, and they got some private equity investment. Bill Foley from the group that owns Bournemouth has come in and bought a club in New Zealand in that league. So I think that's one league. You don't have relegation in that league. You have a salary cap. You have kind of a closed system, which can make it more attractive to investors. So I think that is a league in that part of the world that could be interesting. But really, most of the leagues in Asia are underdeveloped and not sophisticated or professionalized enough, I think, yet to attract foreign investment. That may change, but I think we're probably too early at this point.
Mm, interesting. Okay. Now let's change a little bit the side of the world. Let's go over to closer to where you are, and let's go to Mexico because I've heard also voices that this could be a next hidden gem, if you will, right? So I don't know what your analysis is on the current state of Liga MX, and how does it compare, to MLS? Everybody's talking about MLS lately, in terms of investment, in terms of what they're doing. So what's your take on that?
I mean, I've been really high on Liga MX for quite some time, and putting aside the World Cup being hosted by both the U.S. and Mexico, I think the talent pool in Mexico is very strong. The brands, not just on a global scale, but even here in the US, you have massive brands, massive fan bases. Liga MX is the most popular league in the United States, whether it comes to TV rights and when it comes to the matches played in the United States. So I've always been very high on it. The challenge that the league has had is that it's been very decentralized, where many of the clubs are kind of negotiating their own media rights contracts or owned by media rights executives and companies, and it's a little bit difficult when it's such a fractured environment. But I think there is a lot of talk about a significant investment in the league level and a significant restructure at the league level from serious private equity money, and that presumably could happen at any point in the next 6 to 12 months. And I think that could very well be a game changer for League MX. I think more of a professionalization when it comes to the league structure and the media rights distribution and the way the league is marketed. I think the league is a total sleeping giant. I think there's just so much potential out there. You are starting to see on an individual club level some investment, certainly from the US. I think Necaxa is 50% owned by Americans. Cancun is owned by the folks that own Leganes in Spain, which is American. So there is some foreign investment coming in, but I think there is definitely a hesitancy to go into that market with the challenges and the disorganization at the league level. So I think if and when real private equity comes in, that's going to kind of accelerate, I think, the growth in the league. How does that affect MLS? Obviously they have the Leagues Cup competition that is kind of this joint way to market both leagues. I think that struggled a bit this summer. It was kind of lost in the shuffle when it came to all the other competitions over the summer. But that being said, I think the leagues do feed off each other. MLS is more developed when it comes to the business side of the structure and just the way the league is run. I think from a footballing perspective and maybe a lot more long-term growth perspective and maybe being more undervalued, League MX, I think, has more potential. So I do think both leagues in different ways are probably in pretty good places, but generally speaking, from a quote unquote investment perspective, I think League MX is one of the leagues I believe that has the most long-term growth potential if we're looking at investment. You don't have relegation anymore. They got rid of that, and it remains to be seen if they're going to bring that back. So that gives you downside protection as an investor. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there. But again, it all comes back to, are you, as an investor, are you comfortable doing business in a place like Mexico? Can you feel comfortable that you have good local partners and good partners at the league level? And we'll see how that goes over the next 6 to 12 months.
Yeah, I agree. We had, as you know, our event in Mexico in June. And that was kind of like the feeling, that there's potential, but they've also recognized that they need to become more professional and actually, become more stable, if you will. But I guess I'm wondering, you mentioned the Leagues Cup. Do you think because now the US, Mexico, Canada, they're organizing the World Cup. Do you think there's opportunity for, let's say, the MLS and Liga MX to actually collaborate more, or is it just going to be the Leagues Cup and that's it?
I think the Leagues Cup is probably as far as it's going to go. I don't know what else they could collaborate on in terms of, there is shared interest there, but at the same time, the leagues do compete with each other. Certainly in the US, they're competing for eyeballs, for, TV viewership, they're competing for market share. I think MLS understands that bringing these clubs into the US to play a joint competition will help that product. But at the end of the day, these brands, whether it's Club America or Chivas or, these are massive, massive brands that are much bigger than almost all the MLS clubs out there. And so I think there is certainly a competition between the leagues. And I do think the Leagues Cup is probably the extent of the collaboration, I would think. There is obviously talk that they want to work together and grow the game. But at the end of the day, you know, the largest I think, again, this isn't my job. My job isn't to look at demographics related to MLS, fandom, but a large segment of the fans that are going after are Hispanic or Latino fans who are passionate about soccer, football, and many of them are attached to clubs from Mexico. And MLS is trying to peel off some of those fans, whether it's to become fans of Inter Miami because of Messi or to become a fan of the Galaxy because they signed Chicharito or whatnot. But I think there is that a little bit kind of, uh, you know, they want to keep the leagues close to each other to help both leagues grow. But at the end of the day, they're competitors. Let's be real.
Hmm. Yeah. The thing is, Liga MX needs to speed up a little bit, I would say, no, because traditionally, it was not too long ago. There was a stat that actually it had more viewership than even the Champions League. But now you look at the numbers and you look at the EPL, especially with Manchester City kind of like taking the flag there. They've surpassed Liga MX. So, how do you think what can they do? When the game is becoming more global and you see the EPL, La Liga, all of these, they're targeting the US so hard. What can they do to defend, let's say, their position, if you will?
I mean, I think ultimately a lot of it comes down to governance. And I think, if you look at just getting back to comparing MLS versus League MX, MLS, has a centralized ownership structure. Everything is run through the league office. League MX is very different. And when you have a very decentralized structure with, not, you don't have a lot of strength at the league level to market the league, then ultimately what you have is individual clubs doing what they see fit in their own best interest, not necessarily in the best interest of the growth of the league and or the sport. So I think you do have Mexican clubs coming up and playing matches, lots of matches in the US, but they're not necessarily, I think, designed to grow League MX or compete with the Premier League. They're designed to make money, right? They're doing it with a promoter, and Chivas is playing Club America in Chicago at Soldier Field, and they're going to get a check for a couple $1 million, and they go home, right? I think it takes kind of a sustained strategy at the league level to grow the game in that way. So take the Premier League, right? The Premier League has come over, they're doing fan fest, they're bringing former players over, they're doing it in Chicago, they're doing it in New York, they're doing it in LA. Obviously the games are on NBC. They're doing a lot of kind of the blocking and tackling on the ground in the US market to grow the game. And I think Liga MX still has a long ways to go to do that. They're getting better, no doubt about it. But I think for them to compete with the Premier League, it would take a sustained effort and more organization and more long term strategy from the league. And that presumably, if I was a big private equity firm cutting a big check to the Mexican league, I would want that to be a part of their business plan, to come in and say, look, we're not just giving you money to grow the game and grow your league and to bring in more investment. We're doing this so that you could professionalize and open up offices in the US and create a sustained strategy to hit the US market, because there is so much potential. Because ultimately, it's about how do you grow the sponsorship in the US for the Mexican League? How do you really grow the viewership even more than it already is, so that you can get better media rights deals in the US? So it all kind of feeds into each other. I don't necessarily have all the answers, but I think a lot of it starts at the top with governance at the federation and the league level in Mexico.
Hmm. Yeah. And a little bit of a side note here about the MLS, because last time we talked about the valuations, how they were all increasing and they keep on rising. So I don't know if this is sustainable. And, and I guess to your point, I mean, I was going to ask you if this is something that Mexican clubs could see, but I mean, to your point, I guess it depends on governance, depends on a lot of things that, for actually see that becoming an actual reality,
I think when we look at when you want to look at valuations, I think what really drives valuation growth is stability and certainty in the market. So the reason MLS valuations have exploded is because you don't have a relegation system, you have central governance, you have cost controls in place, you have a system that's designed for stability in the market. Obviously, now you have excellent infrastructure when it comes to soccer specific stadiums. Most of what I just described doesn't really exist in Mexico. Now they've gotten rid of relegation, so that creates some certainty, but just straight doing business in a place like Mexico can create a lot of uncertainty and risk. And so that's has kept the valuations down. And obviously that's what creates potential. But coming in and not just professionalizing the league, but making it, you know, seeing first movers in the league buy clubs in Mexico and run them efficiently and create real sustainable professionalized businesses will, I think, over the long run, raise valuations in Mexico to the point where they're maybe at some point closer to MLS valuations. But it's really just about certainty. And the US market is a market where people feel safe in putting their money into MLS club. People don't feel that way about Mexico right now. Even though the underlying business, I believe, when it comes to the growth on player sales and long-term potential, might be better in a place like Mexico.
Mm. And is there other markets that you believe have that potential? And I'm focusing on LatAm and North America, obviously not, but because we were talking about the US, but any other markets that stand out?
I mean, obviously, the interesting one right now is Brazil. People have talked about it for a while. And I think there was an assumption over the last, let's say, 18 months that there would be a flood of foreign investment in Brazil. That actually hasn't happened. You've seen Eagle Football go in at Botafogo, and then 777 went into Vasco da Gama, which they're running into some issues there. But there hasn't been an influx of investment in Brazil. I think that is for a couple different reasons. The difficulty doing business in a place like Brazil. I think obviously everyone knows why you would want to own a club in Brazil. You can own the talent pipeline in terms of instead of buying a player for 50 million pounds, from a Brazilian club, you can own the club. But I think operationally and creating a sustainable business in a place with that kind of uncertainty, whether it's corruption, infrastructure, whatnot, creates challenges. So I'll be curious to see what that looks like going forward in Brazil. The one market that I've really want to keep my eye on is Argentina. And obviously Argentina right now has a new government in place that's much more pro foreign investment. They've talked potentially in the near future about opening up the clubs to foreign investment and private investment. So right now, community owned assets. So I think obviously if those clubs open up to the opportunity for foreign investment at some point, I think you'll see sophisticated groups come in and look at that market. But at the same time, I own a small stake in a winery in Argentina, and doing business in Argentina over the last 15 years can be very challenging, whether it's inflation or just all the issues that we talked about doing business in Latin America. So I think it takes the right type of investment group to understand the risk factors when it comes to these kind of markets. But at the same time, there is a ton of potential, especially if you're looking from a global football perspective and a way to connect the dots between this massive opportunity from a talent perspective and, Western Europe and these big clubs in Europe.
Yeah, I think I was just thinking when you were answering, similar answer to what I got from Simon Chadwick when I interviewed him on the podcast some months ago. We're gonna have to make that conversation happen because he does want to talk about Mexico and Brazil, and obviously Argentina is probably another conversation to have, no? But anyway, I digress, Jordan. Here. Now speaking about
I think the one thing I'll add on some of these markets is just, I think if you haven't done business in these countries, you think it's no different than doing business in the US or, Western Europe. And they're really difficult places to do business. Take out the football and sport of it.
yeah,
Just doing any business and feeling like your money is not going to disappear, that you're going to be able to get good people to come to a place to operate your business. You're not going to run into corruption and with the government and whatnot. It's just really difficult places to do business. And I think, that's not to say there isn't opportunity there, but I think people vastly underestimate how difficult it is to do business in those places.
yeah, and but you said it before, right? If you have a lot of risk there, I mean, you're not gonna get many investors coming in and just say okay, and especially in football, which is not necessarily the most profitable industry, so you have those two elements there, right? And anyway, and speaking about risk, and shifting to another side of the world again, there's been some concerns lately from American owners about the English Premier League. I mean, we have seen an era where many American investors went into different clubs, but maybe it's just me, but seems that energy, that momentum is kind of like dying down. Is that true, first of all? And if so, why is that happening?
I don't think it's dying down. I think what's interesting is today, the day we're recording this podcast, it looks like that the Friedkin Group agreed to buy Everton, which is obviously a really big deal. American group out of Houston. They own AS Roma already. So, Everton's a really interesting one, and we could probably spend a whole podcast talking about that club. But I think when you have clubs with the history and the brand and obviously a new stadium that Everton does, I think there's always going to be interest. What I see as quote unquote dying down a little bit is the interest in maybe overpaying for assets in not just the Premier League, but in the EFL as well. I think there's starting to come a gap between what the market wants these clubs to be worth and what, in this case, Americans believe they're worth. So, there's plenty of clubs for sale right now, whether it's Brentford or Wolves or West Ham or in the Championship, Watford. And this is all public. These are out there and they've been out there for a while. But these valuations are so far and above what I think are realistic for what the market is looking at, especially since many of these clubs, not all of them, but many of them are loss making businesses. I think what people don't necessarily understand about Americans is most of them are very opportunistic, that at the right price with the right set of circumstances, Americans would buy all of these clubs. But ultimately, it just comes down to what are the terms. And that's why a lot of the folks that I speak to are more interested in distress assets, clubs that are really struggling financially, clubs that are in a place where you can come in and get a really attractive terms, and not just about sale terms, but terms where instead of spending tens of millions of pounds on a football club, you can reinvest that money into the club. I would argue Everton probably fits into this category, even though there's lots of interest challenges there. Everton is clearly distressed. It's been distressed for quite some time. Is it undervalued? We'll see what the terms are when they're announced out in terms of what that looks like. But certainly undervalued in terms of what the potential is for that club. That's a club that should be in Europe, I think, every year. And be commercially should be up there in the top 6 to 8 clubs in England now with their new stadium. So there is a lot of opportunities there. So I think there isn't a day that goes by that I don't have a conversation with new American groups that are interested in both the Premier League and the EFL in England. But it's just about matching that to the market, which is not just what the valuations are of the club. So what is the actual underlying business? And there isn't necessarily a long line of people that are willing to both overpay for a football club and stomach 10, 15, 20, 30 pound losses, which some of these clubs have.
Yeah. Actually, I was going to ask you about that because there was some interesting research, credit to the Sportico guys. I heard on the podcast, and they said something like, that EPL teams collectively, they lost like $800 million, I think it was last season. And when you look at other, you look at the NFL, the franchises, they had revenues of 4.6 billion. So the difference is huge, So do you think, obviously, the dynamics, it's a closed system, the sport is very different, but is there a way to kind of like for the Premier League, because you would argue it's more popular around the world, to actually, let's say, approach that at some point?
I don't think so. I don't think there is a desire to approach the kind of business model that isn't around American sports necessarily. I think obviously as more American investments come into the Premier League, there's been more interest in, to a certain extent, cost controls and running these clubs more like businesses. Although I would argue there's plenty of American groups that aren't running their football clubs like that. I think when you look at the losses in the Premier League, a lot of those are very top heavy. You're looking at the top 4, 5, 6 clubs accounting for most of those losses. I think when you look at the middle to the bottom of the table, whether it's Bill Foley at Bournemouth or whether it's some the guys at Brentford, although they're not American owned, some of these folks are running very sound businesses, whether either they're cash flow positive or they're cash flow neutral, and they're really looking at long term growth when it comes to asset appreciation. But I don't think the NFL in particular, is such a unique business model that will never work in Europe. You have revenue share, like massive revenue share. You have more centralized governance. You have cost control, massive cost controls in place. I just, even though you're right from a brand perspective, these European football clubs are on par in many ways with NFL brands. The structure in and around sport in Europe will never allow them to come anywhere close to that. What I would like to see is a more disciplined and structured approach to cost controls. Obviously you have PSR and you have financial fair play, which you can argue how well that's enforced, and there's ways around it. We're going to sell our hotel to ourselves, and we're going to sell our women's team to someone else. Like all these ways to get around the idea that you're just trying to spend more money to lose more money doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I firmly believe that these football clubs can and should be run like professionalized businesses and also can be community assets at the same time. That they shouldn't, no sustainable business or no business can be sustainable that just burns cash indefinitely, which a lot of these clubs do. So for me, the only way that these Premier League clubs can get anywhere close to some of these top four American sports franchises from a business perspective is controlling for costs. Yes, there's room for revenue growth. Yes, new stadium infrastructure like Everton, like Tottenham helps a lot. And I would say Tottenham is probably the closest football club to an American style, business where they run it very efficiently. They have this fantastic new stadium that they're commercializing with concerts and with other events. And they're running a club in a very American sense, but I don't think there's the appetite in Europe for most clubs to do that. And so if there isn't the appetite, that's okay. But then you really have to be very disciplined about controlling for your costs. I think when I read a lot of football club executives and owners and they're interviewing, all they talk about is growing revenue, grow revenue. And like, yes, that's important. But like, and to a certain extent, there's only so much revenue that you can grow at a football club. What you can do is control for your costs. And that's your biggest cost basis is players, agents, all these kind of things. Like control for your costs and you will run a sustainable business. And then your valuations will grow. And then when you want to sell equity pieces, whether that's a minority or majority stake, then these type of American investors who you're interested in will become more attractive and want to come into your business because you're running a good business. A lot of the football clubs, most football clubs I see are just not good businesses, and that's unfortunate.
Mm. I was actually going to ask you about the PSR rules. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that's going to have a meaningful impact?
Uh, no, I think football clubs will always find ways to get around that. I think I understand the intention, but I think, as I mentioned earlier, whether it's creative ways to sell players to other clubs to me, we see, I sell you a player for 20 million pounds and you sell me an academy player for 20 million pounds and that keeps us both under PSR. Like, I think there's just such a overwhelming desire at most football clubs to spend more money because everyone is convinced that spending more money equals success, which there is a strong correlation, but it's not as strong as people realize. So as long as that exists, it doesn't really matter what the financial fair play rules are and PSR rules are, that people will just always get around them. And, that's unfortunate. It's the same kind of thing when you see at football clubs where folks, clubs take out massive loans on future income. And it's just like everyone's just digging a hole to the future instead of saying, look, why don't we create a sustainable business? Why don't we come in and run a business that no one's saying it has to be even cash flow positive. I'm not even necessarily saying most football clubs have, but they need to be sustainable, right? Because runs a football club. No one that I know that runs a football club enjoys just dumping cash into it. And so I think the PSR stuff is well intentioned and necessary, but will it change the behaviors? No, not until it's more stringent and more and better enforced, and not until the market actually is receptive to those rules being in place. And it's not that way right now, I don't think, fortunately.
Yeah, it's funny. I had a conversation with Keith Wines, former CEO at Everton, actually, and Aston Villa, and he said pretty much the same thing. That clubs are always looking for the loophole, and just where they can get an advantage. And I agree. Unfortunately, that's what seems is going to happen. So in that sense, do you think that American investors would actually consider, looking into other maybe European leagues, go back to MLS, or even some of the markets that we were discussing before, or will they stay put and see how the EPL evolves?
I don't think you're going to see much in MLS, honestly, outside of maybe isolated small LP, minority stakes. The valuations are just too high at this point in MLS. I'm starting to see more Americans looking towards other leagues, whether that's, Spain or France or Italy. Obviously, other leagues have different challenges. But there is interest in other European leagues. I think the French league is a really interesting one right now because there was a pretty significant reduction in their most recent media rights deal, which has reduced the distributions to the clubs, which is a big problem. And obviously that league is very top heavy with PSG. But I think a lot of investors see the opportunity in that league long term, both from a player development perspective, and a lot of the clubs are under commercialized and under marketed and have a lot of opportunity there. So I do think folks are starting to look beyond England. I think there's a lot of interest in the EFL, a lot of interest in whether it's mostly below the championship, because I think the championship, the valuations are still quite high, and the business around I would love to spend a podcast talking about the business behind the EFL championship because it's the craziest thing I've ever seen in my life. Because it's just everyone's chasing the Premier League. Clubs are valued at over 100 million pounds. I would say probably on average off the top of my head, most clubs are losing 15, 20, 25 million pounds a year. And it's just like this race to the bottom that I just can't wrap my head around. But Americans want to get into England, and I don't know if that's a Wrexham thing or a Ted Lasso thing. So there's a lot of interest still, EFL League One, League Two, even National League. There's a lot of interest down there. So it's very varied. It kind of goes all over. But I do think the more sophisticated investors, the ones that probably are driving the market, are still going to be looking at the Premier League. Like I think eventually Brentford will move maybe to American. Eventually Wolves might move, or part of it might move, probably to American Group, maybe. Um, it just is all about at what point does the valuations match up with the market coming in from the US. But the interest level, I just don't think it's going down. I think it's in some ways it's going the opposite, where folks aren't just focused on the Premier League or even Western Europe. They're looking at some of the markets we talked about. They're looking at women's football. There's obviously a lot of interest in women's football. We could probably spend a whole podcast talking about interest investment in women's football. So like the interest is there, but it's not just singular. Like I need to buy a Premier League club or I want to buy a Premier League club. It's a little bit more broad at the moment.
I'm actually right now looking for dates to have that conversation about the EFL and the women's football. So, we're going to have to book that. So actually, and just kind of like, to start wrapping things up, Jordan, I guess if you had to bet on I don't want to say the word, but maybe an unconventional market or some market that you think has that could be the next big thing, would it be Japan? Would it be Mexico? Would it be one that we haven't discussed yet?
For me, it's 100% Japan when it comes to an emerging market for all the reasons we talked about earlier. I think if you're looking at a more traditional market in Western Europe, as I mentioned, I actually really like France right now. I think it's like one of these conversations you have in the stock market or whatever. When everyone else is selling, you should buy, and when everyone else is buying, sell. Everyone is kind of down on the French league right now for obvious reasons because of the media rights. I think there's an opportunity to come in and buy clubs, get into clubs at much lower valuations than would have been 2 or 3 years ago. I think there's a lot of long-term potential there. PSG is not going anywhere. They're still a big global brand. They just got a minority investment from Arctos, and they're building a really fantastic global presence. So they're not going anywhere. The talent pool in France is not going anywhere. Obviously, it goes without saying that doing business in France can be a bit challenging, but for a market in Western Europe, I still am very high on France. But straight up, if someone was like, where should I put my money that I think in 10 or 15 years in football is going to be significantly bigger than it is, I think Japan to me is the place.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, Japan, obviously, as we discussed in France, I agree with you on France. I mean, when everybody's singing, you should be sagging. And that's what I feel too. I think, they've taken a hit, but they will come back. All these major leagues definitely end up coming back, no? So they're always.
And to be fair too, like I do get asked about some of the kind of a little bit smaller leagues in Europe. Certainly we were in Denmark for a while, Belgium, Portugal, some of these leagues. I do think there are specific instances of certain clubs that have a lot of potential in a one-off setting on unique clubs. But generally speaking, my opinion on some of the smaller leagues is there's not enough media rights, there's not enough commercial potential, there's not enough, these countries aren't big enough to create like a real large brand or global business or have real long-term upside. And so that's why I personally feel like if you're going to be in Western Europe, you need to be in and around one of the top 5 leagues, even if you're not in the top division. So even if someone was asking me, would I go into the top division in Belgium versus the second division in France? I would always say France, just because you have the opportunity to get your club up to the top division where you have a pretty decent media rights deal. You can sell players on a global scale the way you probably can't do as much in Belgium. But again, the flip side is you have a club like Sporting Lisbon or Benfica or, some of these, Anderlecht, some of these big clubs in secondary leagues that have their own potential and their own sustainable businesses in their own right. So generally speaking, though, I think it just obviously ultimately it depends on what the motivations are. There's not like a one size fits all. It's what the first question I ask when folks are like, hey, I want to invest in European football or global football is why? Why do you want to do it? What are your motivations? What are your risk tolerance? And all those kind of things.
Actually, I was going to ask you, I mean, and this kind of be a different type of question that I usually ask you, but if you were given the task of creating a new league from scratch, that has to be sustainable, competitive, what would your key features be for success?
What were the key features? I think infrastructure is probably the biggest one. I mean, you can look to MLS in terms of how that league changed once they got soccer specific stadiums. I think you compare it to, like, let's say lower divisions in the US, whether it's the USL, where they're playing in minor league baseball stadiums or converted venues, just the appearance of professionalism, the facilities, infrastructure in and around a league, I think is really important. I think that's what's interesting about European football with this promotion relegation system, where you can get a club promoted with really poor infrastructure, and then maybe they're not ready, maybe they don't qualify in terms of they can't play games, they have to play somewhere else, or maybe you have big clubs. Look at Bordeaux right now, right? They just went bankrupt, and now Bordeaux is now playing in the fourth division in France, in front of tens of thousands of fans in an amateur league. So I think by far and away, infrastructure is probably the most important thing when you're starting a league. Certainly, we can talk about the business model behind it in terms of investment and capital and credible ownership groups. It all always starts at governance and at the top. And that's why, as much as the model is different, and I personally spend my time and have more enjoyment in and around global football, the structures in and around closed leagues like MLS or League in Australia make a lot of sense. Then I understand why people did that. They needed certainty. They would not be able to build these leagues and bring in investment, credible investment, without creating an ecosystem that created more stability for their investors. And I understand that. So certainly the structure of leagues, the infrastructure, all of those things would factor into creating a league and whether that was successful or not.
And is there any piece of advice? Imagine that you were giving quote unquote advice to like a billionaire who's investing in football. Is there any just one piece of advice you would share with him or her?
I mean, for me, and I realize not everyone thinks like this, but for me, it's about taking two steps back and understanding why do you want to do it, understanding what your investment thesis and motivations are, and then bringing in really good people to execute that vision. And I think the challenge is most folks don't take that approach. They're very deal obsessed, or like, hey, a shiny object came across my desk and this is available. And then I buy a club, and all of a sudden you're at a club, and 6 months later, the club's a mess and you have to fire the coach and you're losing a bunch of money. It's kind of like in any other industry, you would want to take the time to understand the markets, understand why you are investing. And then again, I'm a big proponent. I'm sure I've mentioned this on some of our other chats, but human capital is so incredibly important. And that's not just like, hey, we need to hire a great coach and a great sporting director, but we need a really good CEO. We need a really good commercial team. We need a really good operations team, right? If you're an ownership, if you're an investor, a billionaire investor, who's on my board? Who's going to be supporting me? Because I have 10 other businesses here, right? So I think especially when you're talking about football clubs for an American in Europe, you're looking at time 6, 7, 8, 9 hour time difference. You're looking at a 10-hour flight. You're looking at businesses on the other side of the world that maybe language, culture, tax law, labor law, all these different kind of things. So it's about bringing really good people in that and trust can help execute your vision, and doing that from day one.
Yeah. I mean, as you said, we talk about this on every single episode, but at the end of the day, it's about the culture, it's about the people. That's what actually makes a difference, no? So I appreciate that even though the industry is changing so much, there's some fundamentals that we can always trust upon, no? So that's interesting. Jordan, this has been, as always, fun, and informative. I don't know if there's any last words you want to share with the audience before we wrap up.
No, I don't think so. I appreciate you having me on. I'm always interested to talk about this stuff. Global football, the business of global football is just fascinating to me. And that's why I enjoy what I do.
It is. I'm looking for dates now to talk about the EFL and women's football. So I will be coming back to you soon. Okay.
Sounds good.
Jordan, thanks so much as always.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
Bye. And there you have him again, Jordan Gardner. As always, with a fun conversation and informative conversation. Jordan is someone I really enjoy talking to because I learn and I have fun at the same time. So appreciate him coming back to the show. Some things that we talked about today, especially I like what he said about Japan. What they have, just focus on their infrastructure, how the clubs are sustainable, and they're very focused on sustainability. They're backed by big corporations, and that's important. They're focused on player development, and now they're finally opening up to foreign investment. So, at the end of the day, all these elements combine and make it for an interesting destination in terms of where the next big opportunity in football could be. So let's keep an eye out for that. I also like what he said about Mexico, and I fully agree. I think the potential is there, the vision is there, the ambition is there. It's just a matter of really what they need to do is to become more professional. But to that point, I remember World Football Summit Americas. I mean, you did get that energy. You did get that sense that people were aware of what they were missing, and I think it's encouraging where it could go. It's just a matter of again improving the certainty and the stability of the league. No, they have to focus on having a strong governance structure and the leagues and investment and all that. But again, it could be encouraging. Some of the stuff that we talked about, let's look at how other markets like Brazil and Argentina are evolving. let's see if in the future those become interesting areas to look into. But again, all these leagues and all these clubs, they need to focus on cost control. We were talking about this when we were discussing the Premier League, right? It's not just about growing revenues and just the sake of growth. You have to do it in a sustainable manner. You have to, really look at controlling your cost and having that stability. And speaking about stability, at the end of the day, you know what that it brings, and that's something. It always comes up when we speak up. We speak with Jordan. You know how important culture and the people and the investment thesis. I mean, the fundamentals. I mean, those are coming back always in our conversations because it's true. You really need a good culture that values stability, and in order to have that those results in the long term, from a business and from a sporting side of things, right? So anyway, that's what stood out to me from this conversation with Jordan. As always, reach out on social media. Let us know what you thought about it. Feel free to share any of the takeaways and of course, share this episode with anyone that you think can get value out of it. Again, if you share it, it helps us a lot bring top-tier guests like Jordan and others that are coming on the show. And nothing really from my side. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned. And hopefully, I'll see you on the next episode of the World Football Summit podcast. Have a great rest of your day, guys. Bye.